Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, today is the 1st of December already. That's quite frightening. But anyways, I thought it'd be interesting to make a video about, December, presidential facts about December. And that being that there are 3 presidents born in the month of December. Martin Van Buren on the 5th, Woodrow Wilson on the 28th, and Andrew Johnson on the 29th. Meaning one thing: there hasn't been a president born in the month of December in over 100 years. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 3rd president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, was quite an interesting person. He liked to hum and sing to himself when he was alone, which I think, honestly, aren't we all a little guilty of that? Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 4th president of the United States, James Madison, was infamously very, very short. He was only about 5'4" and was the only American president out of all the 45 men who have served as United States president to be shorter than his wife. And James Buchanan didn't have one, so I guess out of 44. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. If you were to guess which American president was the very last one to have been inaugurated with a World War II leader still alive, what would your guess be? Ronald Reagan? Bill Clinton? No, it's neither. It's Donald Trump. Not in his first term, but even in his second term. Because in the first term, King Michael of Romania was still alive. He died in December of 2017. But in the second term, we still have Simeon II of Bulgaria, who was 6 years old when World War II started, and he was placed on the Bulgarian throne. He's still alive. In fact, he would actually serve as Bulgaria's prime minister after the communist regime there fell. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, is widely regarded as one of, if not the best, American president ever. But he was definitely not the smartest one. Although he was pretty intelligent, obviously. He got less than 12 months of formal education. What does that tell you? Hello, I'm Dazad500, and it is literally 5:30, and it is very, very dark. Well, welcome to Canada. But anyways, 7th president of the United States was Andrew Jackson. And one very little known detail, because there's a lot of known details about Andrew Jackson, not this detail is very well known, and that is that he once had a 1,400-pound wall of cheese in the White House on display for 2 whole years. Luckily, I've lost my sense of smell, but if I didn't, I wouldn't want to be at the White House. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Today marks the anniversary of when Delaware became the very first state in the United States to ratify the Constitution of the United States in 1787. And despite technically being the state for the longest amount of time, no American president has been born there. Interestingly, there was an American president born in the most recent addition into the United States, Hawaii, Barack Obama, the 44th. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, today is December the 8th, 2025. It marks 84 years since, in my opinion, the most influential speech given by an American president. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. Back then, the United States Congress declared war on other countries, not the president. And this speech given by Franklin Roosevelt was so convincing that Congress declared war on the Empire of Japan later that day. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Everybody knows the 2nd president, John Adams, was a Federalist. In fact, he was the only Federalist president. Very, you'd get that in kindergarten presidential knowledge. But what you won't get, unless you're on the Dazod 500 channel, of course, is that John Adams actually switched parties to the Democratic Republican Party later on in 1809. Now, I'm not 100% sure why he did this, but his son, John Quincy Adams, was a Democratic Republican pretty much from day one. So I think it's very interesting. Hello, I'm Dazod 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Not very many presidents of the United States did not have children, but the 11th president didn't have children, James Polk. And that's likely because he, when he was 11 years old, had to undergo kidney surgery. And back in the 1800s, surgery wasn't exactly the funnest thing you wanted to do back then. It wasn't for James Polk because he didn't have any anesthesia back then. And, he had surgery while he was awake. And that likely made him celibate for the rest of his life. Hello, I'm Dazod 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, very many people know, I hope everybody knows, that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April the 14th, 1865, and died the next day on the 15th. However, what many people don't know is that actually that was a larger plot by Confederate sympathizers to pretty much kill the whole Union government. Vice President Andrew Johnson, who eventually became president, was also supposed to be killed, but the guy who was going to kill him chickened out at the last minute and got drunk instead. Another guy was in charge of killing Secretary of War, Edward Stanton, and he almost nearly did, striking him in the neck, but he survived because he had a metal brace around that area because he got injured recently in that area. Hello, I'm Dazod 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. In the year 1843, 10th President of the United States, John Tyler, was aboard the Princeton, USS Princeton ship. And that's cool, right? Nothing bad could happen. Oh, wait, the ship exploded and a bunch of his cabinet members died, and John Tyler was very, very close to dying himself. Now, of course, Tyler was vice president to William Henry Harrison, who died and made Tyler president. Tyler didn't have a vice president because that wasn't a thing in the Constitution yet. So what would have happened had Tyler died? Well, Speaker of the House would become acting president until another election could be held in that fall. Hello, I'm Dazod 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. When presidents get inaugurated, obviously their very first trip that they make abroad is a very important way to signal how that presidency is going to be. If it's to an ally, then, well, they're going to be working with their allies. If it's to a country like Russia, maybe they're trying to ease relations with Russia. Trump's very first meeting as president in his first term was to Saudi Arabia, which Saudi Arabia relations with the United States are very complicated. It's like kind of, sort of like, and also kind of hate. So I think that's very interesting. And I mean, every single time I make one about a recent president, someone's going to think I'm trying to be coercive in a political way. I'm not. I'm just, I've made, 300 facts now. There's only so many more facts left, right? Hello, I'm Dazod 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Nowadays, using the phone is a very big part of life, but of course the phone wasn't around forever. It was invented in the mid-1870s. President at that time would have been Rutherford Hayes. He was the very first president to ever use a telephone, and his phone number was simply just 1. Hello, I'm Dazod 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. One of the biggest liars in American history has hands down got to be Woodrow Wilson. There's no arguing about it. And this is evident in the 1916 presidential campaign. This is when he was up for re-election against Republican Charles Evans Hughes. His presidential slogan was literally, well, he kept us out of war. He should be the nominee again because he kept us out of war the first time, you can do it the second time. Sure, cool, but like a month later, he got the United States into World War I, and everyone hated him for that. and the Democrats lost huge at the 1920 election. Hello, I'm Dezad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Today is the anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, where a bunch of people in Boston threw tea into the ocean to protest British taxes. And one of the main leaders of the Boston Tea Party was none other than Samuel Adams. Yes, that Samuel Adams. For my friends who are over, I think the legal drinking age is 22 in the United States. So for my friends over 22, yes, that's Samuel Adams. Second cousin of second president of the United States, John Adams, who was not there, but he did celebrate the Boston Tea Party, saying that it was one of the best things that could have happened. Hello, I'm Dezad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Shoes aren't the only thing that George W. Bush has a hard time with, because he has hard times with eating pretzels, because one time he was eating a pretzel and he actually choked so hard on the pretzel that he actually fainted. And I think pretzels are awesome, so I hope a pretzel doesn't come and make me faint. I don't want to faint over a pretzel. But George W. Bush probably didn't either, so be careful when you eat pretzels, guys. Hello, I'm Dezad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. William Henry Harrison, the 9th president of the United States, died in office. He was the very first to do that. He died in office in April of 1841. And in 1841, well, I mean, news wasn't the best thing. That if you wanted to get it quick, it wasn't really news by the time you got it. And it definitely wasn't for Los Angeles residents. They were notified over 100 days after Harrison had died, 3 times as long as his actual presidency lasted. Hello, I'm Dezad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 42nd president of the United States was Bill Clinton. However, his ancestry wasn't always in the United States, of course, because he's not First Nations. He actually can trace some ancestry back to France. And I know this because he is a direct descendant of King Robert I of France. King Robert. Hello, I'm Dezad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. We already talked about on this channel before the 33rd president, Harry Truman, and how he was a known racist. He was known to have said the N-word privately multiple times, but we already talked about that. Today is a different day. We're going to talk about how Harry Truman at one point considered joining the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. This was early on in his life, and we're all a little crazy, and he grew to strongly detest the KKK afterwards, but there was a time when an American president thought about joining the KKK, and it wasn't Andrew Johnson. What a surprise. Anyways, guys, today is actually my 5-year anniversary here posting videos on YouTube. Click the related video for my 5-year recap. It's 25 minutes long, and yeah, I know it's a lot. Hello, I'm Dezad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Let's see if I can get this on this first attempt. I think it's the 37th president, Richard Nixon. I think I'm right, actually. 37th president, Richard Nixon, had a favorite Mexican restaurant. And he visited that place so many times that that favorite Mexican restaurant, actually gave him a chair specifically designed for him whenever he would go and enjoy their food, I guess. Hello, I'm Dezad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Through most of just world history, having a middle name was kind of weird. In fact, last names are relatively recent, and I say relatively, they're like 600, 700 years old, 6, 7. They're pretty new, but middle names are even newer. Most American presidents didn't have a middle name for the first 100 years. And Theodore Roosevelt did not have a middle name, but every single president since Theodore Roosevelt has had a middle name. Hello, I'm Dezad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 5th president of the United States was James Monroe, and he wasn't only president, he was ambassador to France. At one of the most important times, the French Revolution. He was actually ambassador when Napoleon became Emperor of France, and he attended Napoleon's coronation. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Today's Christmas Eve, but I'm not going to talk about Christmas today. I'm going to talk about the nuclear codes instead. The nuclear codes are pretty important. You can't just have anybody knowing the nuclear code, so it's really only the president. And one of the presidents was Jimmy Carter, who was president during the late 70s, who once put the nuclear codes in his pants and sent them to the dryer. That's very unsafe. You really shouldn't be doing that, Jimmy Carter. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 23rd president of the United States was a lawyer. In fact, most politicians are lawyers, and Benjamin Harrison was a lawyer as well. And he was such a good lawyer that he was actually hired to argue 15 cases before the very own Supreme Court of the United States, which just goes to show, like, if you're arguing in front of the Supreme Court, you probably made it big. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Yesterday, I was reading a book about the founding of the United States, and that got me the idea to talk about founding fathers of the United States, one of which being John Adams, who was the second president and a founding father. Now, we think of the founding father presidents as the first five: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Four of those were from Virginia. Adams was from Massachusetts, and thus was the only founding father president not from Virginia. He was from Massachusetts. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The very first president of the United States, George Washington, was not only the very first president to be president, he was not only the very first president, but the very first person in all of America to be a mule breeder. Now, I'm not 100% sure what that is. I just found that on my list of facts, so I'm sharing that with you. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Today is New Year's Eve, and 2 days ago was the 29th, which marked the 1-year anniversary of the passing of Jimmy Carter. So I thought we should make a fact about Jimmy Carter, since I was sick these past 3 days with the flu, so there wasn't really much I could do to make a presidential fact of the day, let alone walk outside and do it, which is what I usually do. But Jimmy Carter was actually attacked by a rabbit, and Napoleon was attacked by a rabbit. So that actually concludes that Jimmy Carter was actually Napoleon. Happy New Year's, guys.